Welcome, dreamers, to Mr. Sandman's Corner of the Night. I am your host, Mr. Sandman, the weaver of nightmares and your guide through the realm of shadows. Here in this space between waking and dreaming, we tell stories meant to chill your soul and ignite your imagination. Each tale is crafted to stir something deep within: fear, wonder, and maybe even that little voice in your mind that asks, what if? From ghostly whispers to unrelenting horrors, this is the place where bedtime isn't a reprieve. It's an invitation to the unknown. If you find yourself drawn to the dark, captivated by the eerie, and longing for more tales that keep you glancing over your shoulder, then you're in the right place. So, before we dive into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell icon. It's not just a way to support us, it's your key to never missing a single tale. Follow me into the shadows, and let's keep the dark alive together. Now, dreamers, are you ready to step into the unknown? The shadows of Pine Creek. The tires of Mark's truck crunched over gravel as they pulled into the clearing. Cindy leaned forward in her seat, her blue eyes widening as the cabin came into view. Nestled among towering pines and framed by the soft glow of the morning sun, it looked like something out of a storybook. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, her southern drawl lingering on his name. "It's perfect." Mark cut the engine and stepped out, his imposing frame unfolding as he scanned the property. The cabin was small but sturdy, its wooden beams weathered with time yet full of character. A wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with a swinging bench and a stack of firewood neatly tucked against the wall. Beyond the cabin, a ribbon of sparkling water wound its way through the trees, the sound of the river carrying on the cool mountain air. "It's got potential," Mark said, his deep voice steady. "Needs some love, but yeah, I think this is it." Cindy stepped out, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She turned slowly, taking in the view. The dense forest, the open sky, the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you lean in to listen, the kind that pressed against your ears until you swore you could hear the earth breathing. "I can see us here," she said, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Rocking on that porch, sipping coffee in the mornings, maybe even raising a few chickens." Mark grinned, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. "And when we're not here, we let other folks get a taste of the good life. They'll pay a premium for something like this." Together they walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking softly beneath their weight. The front door opened with a groan, revealing an interior bathed in golden light, filtering through dusty windows. The cabin smelled of cedar and thyme, a faint musk that spoke of decades past. The living room was simple, but inviting, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a pair of rocking chairs facing it. A small kitchen tucked into the corner boasted a porcelain sink, and a row of cabinets painted a faded green. Mark ran his hand over the banister of the staircase leading to the loft. Solid construction, just needs a little work to make it shine. Cindy knelt by the hearth, brushing her fingers over the cold, blackened stone. "It's got character," she said, a soft smile curving her lips. "I love it." They spent the rest of the day walking the property, exploring the dense woods and the riverbank. Mark pointed out the potential for fishing, while Cindy imagined flower beds and a small garden. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they were sold. "This is it," Cindy said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "This is our place." Cindy stood on the porch, a paintbrush in one hand and a cold glass of sweet tea in the other. The early morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the wooden boards. The porch swing creaked softly in the breeze, its chain hanging loose on one side, a project for another day. Mark was by the river, shirtless and knee-deep in water, hauling out a fallen tree limb that had lodged itself against the rocks. His broad shoulders gleamed with sweat, his movements slow and deliberate as he wrestled the stubborn wood free. "Careful with that," Cindy called out, setting her tea down. "You're not as young as you used to be, you know." Mark glanced back, a crooked grin on his face. "I'm not old either," he shot back, his voice carrying over the water. With a final heave, the limb came free, splashing water high into the air. The cabin had come alive under their care. Cindy had spent hours sanding and staining the porch, transforming the weathered boards into a rich, honeyed hue. Mark had rebuilt the steps leading down to the river, adding a small dock where they could sit and fish or dip their toes on warm summer evenings. Inside, they'd worked together to breathe new life into the old structure. Cindy had chosen soft cream paint for the walls, accented by deep green curtains that framed the windows like a forest embrace. The kitchen cabinets gleamed with fresh polish, and the fireplace now held a stack of carefully arranged logs, ready to crackle and pop on chilly nights. Even the smallest details had been given attention. Mark had crafted a new mantel for the fireplace, sanding the wood smooth and staining it a deep walnut. Cindy had filled it with small touches, a vase of dried wildflowers, a framed picture of the two of them hiking in the Smokies, and an old clock that ticked softly in the background. The property itself was like something out of a painting. Wildflowers sprouted in bursts of color along the riverbank, their petals swaying in the breeze. A narrow trail wound its way through the woods, marked by patches of moss and clusters of mushrooms that glowed faintly in the evening light. "It's starting to look like a real home," Cindy said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. She leaned into Mark's side, her head resting against his shoulder. "It's more than that," Mark replied, his voice low. "It's a dream. Our dream." Cindy smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lantern hanging above them. "It's perfect," she whispered, though something in the back of her mind, the faintest whisper of unease, told her that perfection always came with a price. After months of sweat, splinters, and late nights, the cabin was ready. Mark and Cindy stood on the porch, admiring their work as the morning sun filtered through the trees. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a retreat, a haven. "I almost don't want to rent it out," Cindy said, her arms crossed as she leaned against the railing. Mark chuckled, slipping an arm around her waist. "We'll get our share of time here. Plus, a little extra income never hurts." Cindy smiled, tilting her head to rest against his shoulder. "Fine," she said with mock reluctance, "but they better treat it right." It didn't take long for the cabin to attract attention. Cindy's meticulous listing on a popular vacation rental site showcased the cabin's charm in perfect detail. Photos of the rustic porch, the gleaming kitchen, and the cozy loft bedroom with its view of the river. She described it as a hidden gem in the Appalachian foothills, perfect for escaping the hustle of daily life. The first few renters loved it. They left glowing reviews. "Peaceful and beautiful. My wife and I spent the weekend fishing and hiking. Can't wait to come back." The cabin was everything we hoped for. Cozy, clean, and surrounded by nature. Perfect for a romantic getaway. Mark and Cindy felt a warm pride each time they read the feedback. Sharing the cabin wasn't just about income, it was about letting others experience the serenity they'd found. But then the complaints started. The first one came from a young couple, excited for a weekend of adventure. They'd only stayed one night before leaving early. "Everything was fine at first," the email read, "but there were strange noises outside at night. We heard something heavy walking around the cabin, and we're pretty sure we saw something moving near the tree line. We know the area has bears, but this didn't feel normal. We didn't feel safe." Mark shrugged it off as he read the message aloud. "Bears?" he said, handing Cindy his phone. "Probably sniffing around for food. People get spooked when they're not used to the woods." Cindy nodded, though the unease in her chest didn't entirely go away. The second complaint came a week later. A family of 4 had planned to stay for 3 nights but left after 2. There were strange noises at night, deep guttural sounds, and on the second morning we found large footprints in the mud near the river. We're all outdoorsy people, but this was unnerving. Cindy frowned as she read the message. They even included a picture, she said, showing Mark her phone. The photo was grainy, but it clearly showed an enormous footprint in the soft earth, toes splayed wide. Bear, Mark said again, but his tone was less certain this time. As more complaints trickled in, Cindy began to feel the weight of their renter's fear. Whispers of strange sightings, the sense of being watched, and even the odd claw marks appearing on the porch railing. It's just the wilderness, Mark said one evening as they sat by the fire, sipping glasses of wine. People aren't used to it. Black bears, coyotes, maybe even a bobcat. They're harmless unless you provoke them. Cindy nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about the way people described those sounds, those footprints, too big for a bear, too deliberate. Maybe we should stay there for a weekend, Cindy suggested, trying to keep her tone light. See what all the fuss is about. Mark raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a playful smirk. A romantic getaway? You sure you're not just looking for an excuse? She laughed, leaning into his side. Maybe. But it wouldn't hurt to check things out. Mark kissed the top of her head, his deep voice reassuring. All right, let's do it. Just you, me, and our friendly neighborhood bear. Neither of them realized how much their dream cabin was about to change. The morning they left for the cabin was crisp and golden, the kind of early autumn day that hinted at the chill of winter while still clinging to the warmth of summer. Cindy packed a picnic basket with fresh bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine, humming to herself as she added a folded blanket. Mark loaded the truck with their bags, along with a cooler stocked with steaks and vegetables for grilling. You'd think we were going for a week, he teased, closing the tailgate. Cindy stepped out onto the porch, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. I like to be prepared, she said, flashing him a smile. Besides, this is our first real break in months. I want it to be perfect. The drive to the cabin was peaceful, the winding road taking them deeper into the woods. The trees were ablaze with color, their leaves a patchwork of fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. Cindy rolled down her window, letting the crisp air whip through her hair. Look at that, she said, pointing to a ridge where the trees opened up to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Mark glanced over, his hand resting on the wheel. Beautiful, he said, though his eyes lingered on her more than the view. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high in the sky, casting warm light over the property. The cabin looked as inviting as ever, its freshly stained porch glowing in the golden light. Cindy unpacked their picnic on the dock by the river, laying out the blanket and setting the food in neat arrangements. Mark lit a fire in the outdoor pit, the scent of burning wood mingling with the fresh, earthy air. They spent the afternoon lounging by the river, the sound of the water soothing and rhythmic. Cindy read from a dog-eared paperback, while Mark fished from the dock. His tall frame relaxed as he cast his line into the current. As evening fell, they moved inside, the cabin glowing with the warmth of lamplight and the crackling fire. Cindy had set the table with candles and their best wine glasses, their dinner of grilled steaks and roasted vegetables filling the small space with mouth-watering aromas. To us, Mark said, raising his glass as they sat across from each other. Cindy clinked her glass against his, her smile soft. To us, she echoed. After dinner, they curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over their legs as the fire danced in the hearth. Mark's arm was wrapped around Cindy's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. I'm glad we came, she murmured. Me too, he replied, his voice low. It feels good to be here together, without anyone else around. The night was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods. "I could stay here forever," Cindy said softly. Mark kissed the top of her head, his voice a gentle rumble. "Me too." Outside, the forest watched. The fire had burned low, the glowing embers casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Cindy stretched beneath the blanket, the warmth of the flames and Mark's steady breathing lulling her into a peaceful haze. Outside, the world had grown impossibly quiet. The sounds of the river, the rustle of leaves, and even the occasional call of the owl seemed to have vanished. Mark stirred beside her, his brow furrowing. "Do you hear that?" Cindy opened her eyes, blinking sleepily. "Hear what?" He sat up slightly, his head cocked toward the window. The cabin creaked softly in the silence, the kind of sound that houses made when settling into the cold night air. "Nothing," Mark said after a moment, shaking his head. "That's the thing, it's too quiet." Cindy sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Now that he'd mentioned it, she felt it too. The absence of sound, like the forest was holding its breath. "Maybe it's the weather," she offered, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. She got up and padded to the window, her bare feet cool against the wooden floor. She peered out into the dark, her reflection ghostly in the glass. The porch lay empty, the swing swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond it, the tree line stood still and imposing, the shadows between the trunks deep and endless. "Nothing," she said, turning back to Mark. Then it came, a low, guttural sound, distant but unmistakable, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Cindy's neck stand on end. It wasn't a howl, nor the growl of a bear. It was deeper, resonant, like the rumble of a massive engine heard through thick fog. Mark was on his feet in an instant, his tall frame tense. What the hell was that? Cindy crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were, miles from anyone. "It's probably just an animal," she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. Mark grabbed the flashlight from the mantel, its beam cutting through the darkness as he opened the front door. The night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint, earthy smell of the forest. "Mark, don't," Cindy said, her voice tight. He held the door open with one hand, the other gripping the flashlight. "It's fine," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I just want to take a look." She followed him to the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. The flashlight's beam danced across the yard, illuminating the porch swing, the fire pit, and the edge of the woods. The sound came again, closer this time, a guttural growl that seemed to reverberate in their chests. "There," Mark said, the light catching something at the tree line. It was brief, just the faintest glint of reflection, like eyes catching the light, but it was enough to send Cindy's heart racing. "Mark," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "I see it," he said, his voice steady but low. The light swept over the spot again, but whatever had been there was gone. The woods were still, the darkness swallowing the beam like a predator with its prey. "Probably a bear," Mark said, lowering the flashlight, but not entirely convincing himself. Cindy didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the trees, her breath shallow. She could feel it now, that same prickling sensation she'd felt the first time they'd seen the cabin, the feeling of being watched. "Let's go inside," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, and together they retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind them. As the night deepened, the sounds began to change, scraping against the porch, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, a low, rhythmic tapping at the window that made Cindy's stomach churn. Mark stood by the fireplace, his jaw tight and his hands gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Cindy sat curled on the couch, her eyes darting toward every creak and groan of the cabin. "It's just the wind," Mark said again and again, but each time his voice carried less conviction. Outside, the forest remained silent, except for the sound of something large and unseen shifting in the dark. The The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. Cindy pulled her knees to her chest, her eyes flickering to the clock on the mantel. Midnight. Mark had stationed himself by the window, peering out into the blackness beyond the glass. His flashlight was off now. He said it only gave away their position, but his hand gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. "It's nothing," he muttered for the third time, though he hadn't moved in minutes. Cindy didn't reply. Her ears strained against the silence, picking up every creak and groan of the cabin, every subtle shift of the wind. Then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound. It wasn't the wind. It was heavier, more deliberate, something moving through the leaves outside. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I hear it," he said, not taking his eyes off the window. The rustling grew louder, closer. It circled the cabin, pausing occasionally as though whoever or whatever was outside was stopping to listen. And then the sound of breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, a deep labored exhale, the kind that spoke of something massive and alive. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice low and firm. Cindy grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Don't you dare go out there." "I'm not," he said, gently prying her fingers away. "But I need to see what's out there." He moved to the back door, the one that led to the porch overlooking the river. The sound seemed to follow him, shifting to that side of the cabin as if the thing outside knew where he was. Cindy stood frozen in the middle of the room, her breath shallow. She could feel it again, that unbearable weight of being watched, of something just beyond her line of sight. The tapping started again. At first it was faint, a single, rhythmic knock against the glass of the front window. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped to the sound. "Mark?" she called out, her voice shaking. "I'm here," he answered from the back of the cabin, his voice tense. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Cindy stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see the window now, could make out the faint outline of something just beyond the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The flashlight beam cut through the room as Mark returned, sweeping it toward the window. For a brief, horrifying moment, the light caught something, a large, shadowy figure with eyes that glinted like polished stone. It was gone before either of them could register what they'd seen, disappearing into the shadows so quickly it left them doubting whether it had been there at all. "What the hell was that?" Cindy whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was already moving to the door, his jaw tight as he threw the deadbolt into place. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But it's not a bear." They stood in silence, their ears straining for any sound. The cabin felt smaller now, its walls pressing in as the presence outside grew heavier, more oppressive. And then the footsteps returned. Heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin with a slow, menacing rhythm. They stopped at the front door, and for a moment everything went still. The doorknob rattled. Cindy's breath caught in her throat as the knob twisted, shaking violently before falling silent. Mark raised the flashlight, his body blocking hers as they backed toward the fireplace. The sound of splintering wood erupted from the porch, followed by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the cabin like a warning, and then silence again. Whatever was outside wasn't leaving. The silence was unbearable. Cindy clung to Mark, her nails digging into his arm, as they stood frozen by the fireplace. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, every creak of the wood amplified in the oppressive quiet. Then came the first bang. The front door shook in its frame, the impact so violent it sent Cindy stumbling backward. Bang, bang, bang. The door groaned, its hinges straining against the force. Mark raised the flashlight, its beam trembling as he aimed it toward the door. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Cindy didn't argue. She moved behind him, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Another bang, this one louder, angrier. The wood splintered at the edges, the frame cracking like dry twigs. "It's not stopping," Cindy whispered, her voice trembling. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the wood shattering into pieces that flew across the room. Mark shielded Cindy with his body, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as the creature stepped into the cabin. It was massive, its frame filling the doorway. Tall and broad, its matted fur was dark and wet, clinging to its body in twisted patches. The head was broad, the jaw jutting forward, with teeth that gleamed in the dim light. But it was the eyes that froze Cindy in place, large, black, and intelligent, like deep pools of ink that reflected nothing, and yet seemed to see everything. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature let out a guttural roar, the sound so powerful it seemed to vibrate the walls. Mark shoved Cindy toward the staircase. "Go! Get to the loft!" She hesitated for only a moment before scrambling up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Mark stood his ground, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice filled with both fury and fear. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped forward, its heavy footfalls shaking the floor. It let out another growl, deeper this time, its breath visible in the cold air as it bore down on Mark. Mark swung the flashlight, the metal casing connecting with the creature's arm with a dull thud. It barely reacted, its eyes locked on him as it reached out with a massive hand. "Mark!" Cindy screamed from the loft, her voice breaking. The creature lunged and Mark dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. He grabbed a log from the hearth and swung it with all his strength, the wood splintering against the creature's chest. "Cindy, stay up there," he shouted, his voice strained. The creature roared again, louder this time, its fury shaking the very air. It turned toward the loft, its gaze locking onto Cindy. "No!" Mark yelled, throwing himself between the creature and the staircase. He grabbed a chair, swinging it like a shield. The creature swatted it away with a single blow, the wood shattering as though it were made of paper. Mark was thrown back, crashing into the wall with a grunt. Cindy screamed, her hands clutching the banister as the creature advanced. It paused at the foot of the stairs, its head tilting as it studied her, its breath heavy and deliberate, and then it moved. The stairs groaned beneath its weight as it climbed, each step slow and deliberate. Cindy scrambled back, her hands fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. "Cindy, jump!" Mark's voice cut through the chaos, filled with desperation. She looked down at him, her heart wrenching at the sight of him struggling to stand. "I can't," she cried. "You have to." The creature was almost at the top now, its massive hands gripping the banister as it loomed closer. Cindy's back hit the wall, her eyes wide as she stared into the void of its gaze. And then, in a blur of motion, Mark was there. He charged up the stairs, a broken table leg in his hand like a spear. "Leave her alone," he roared, driving the makeshift weapon into the creature's side. The creature howled, the sound deafening, as it whipped around and struck Mark with a force that sent him crashing down the stairs. Cindy's scream tore through the cabin as Mark hit the floor with a sickening thud. The creature turned back to her, its chest heaving as it stepped closer. Its hand reached out, claws gleaming in the firelight. And then, the sound of the fire poker scraping against stone. Mark, bloodied but alive, staggered to his feet, the poker gripped tightly in his hand. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice raw. "Over here!" The creature paused, its head snapping toward him. "Come on, you bastard," Mark growled, raising the poker like a sword. With a final guttural roar, the creature leapt toward him, its massive body crashing down with earth-shaking force. The creature lunged at Mark, its massive claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Mark barely dodged, the fire poker slipping from his grasp as he hit the ground hard. "Mark," Cindy's voice cracked as she leaned over the banister, her blonde hair falling in wild waves around her face. The creature roared again, a sound that rattled the very walls of the cabin, and turned toward Mark, who was scrambling backward, blood smeared across his face. His hand searched blindly for anything he could use to defend himself. "Come on, damn it," he muttered, his fingers closing around the jagged remains of the broken chair. With a surge of adrenaline, he swung the wood upward as the creature descended on him, driving the splintered edge deep into its arm. The creature howled in pain, staggering back. Its black eyes burned with fury as it yanked the wood from its arm, tossing it aside like a twig. Thick, dark blood oozed from the wound, the sight both horrifying and oddly human. Mark used the momentary distraction to crawl toward the fire poker, his hands slipping on the blood-slick floor. Just as his fingers closed around the cold metal, the creature lunged again. Not this time, Mark growled, rolling onto his back and thrusting the poker upward with all his strength. The sharp tip sank into the creature's chest, stopping at mid-lunge. It let out a guttural, choking roar, its massive body convulsing as it stumbled back. Cindy was on the stairs now, a cast-iron pan clutched in her trembling hands. "Mark!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Stay back!" Mark barked, his voice strained. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. The creature swayed, its dark blood pooling on the cabin floor. For a moment it seemed as though it might collapse, but then it straightened, pulling the fire poker from its chest with a sickening wet sound. "Oh, come on," Mark shouted, frustration and fear boiling over. The creature hurled the poker across the room, where it clanged against the stone fireplace. Its breathing was ragged now, its movement slower but no less deliberate as it turned back to Mark. Mark backed toward the stairs, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no plan, only Cindy, standing above him, her wide eyes filled with terror and determination. The creature charged. Cindy acted without thinking. She swung the cast-iron pan with all her might as the creature reached the base of the stairs. The pan connected with its head with a sickening crack, the force of the blow sending it reeling. "Go! Get outside!" Cindy screamed, grabbing Mark by the arm and pulling him toward the door. The creature recovered quickly, shaking its massive head as it let out a bone-chilling snarl. It was wounded, furious, and relentless. Mark kicked the door open, the cold night air rushing in. Cindy was already halfway out when the creature lunged again, its claws scraping the doorframe as Mark yanked her clear. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the trees. They ran blindly into the woods, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip them at every step. Behind them, the creature crashed through the trees, its guttural growls echoing in the darkness. "This way," Mark shouted, pulling Cindy toward the river. They splashed into the icy water, their feet slipping on the smooth stones beneath the surface. The creature hesitated at the edge, its black eyes gleaming as it watched them. "What's it doing?" Cindy whispered, clinging to Mark. "Waiting," Mark said, his voice grim. The creature let out a roar that shook the very air, and then it stepped into the river. "We can't outrun it," Cindy said, her voice breaking. Mark looked around wildly, his eyes landing on the jagged rocks further downstream. "We don't have to outrun it," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "What?" Mark didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the rocks. "Trust me." The creature followed, its heavy body churning the water as it closed the distance between them. Mark reached the rocks and climbed onto one, helping Cindy up just as the creature lunged again. This time, it lost its footing, the slick stone sending it crashing into the water. "Now!" Mark shouted, grabbing a large rock and bringing it down with all his strength on the creature's head. Cindy joined him, tears streaming down her face as she picked up another rock and struck the creature again and again. Finally, the creature stopped moving. Its body floated for a moment before sinking beneath the rushing water, disappearing into the dark depths. They stood there, shaking and breathless, the river washing the blood from their hands. "Is it dead?" Cindy whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as the adrenaline began to fade. "We're alive," he said finally, his voice raw. "That's all that matters." The forest was eerily quiet as Cindy and Mark staggered out of the river, their clothes soaked and clinging to their bodies. Every muscle in Cindy's leg screamed in protest, but she forced herself to keep moving, Mark's arm slung over her shoulder as they stumbled through the trees. "Just a little further," Mark muttered, though his voice sounded distant, heavy with exhaustion. The cabin was a dim silhouette against the night sky when they finally emerged from the woods. The door hung askew on its hinges, the shattered remnants of their once perfect haven spread across the porch like the aftermath of a storm. Cindy paused, her heart thundering in her chest as she stared at the open doorway. The idea of stepping back inside made her stomach twist, but they had no choice. The keys to the truck were inside, and the truck was their only way out of the mountains. "Stay close to me," Mark said, his voice strained but steady. He reached for the fire poker, which lay discarded near the porch steps, its tip still slick with the creature's blood. Cindy nodded, clutching a broken piece of the banister like a club as they approached the cabin. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the wind against the walls setting her nerves on edge. Inside, the damage was worse than it had seemed. Furniture was overturned, deep claw marks scored the walls, and dark blood smeared the floor where the creature had stood. The air was thick with the metallic tang of it, mingling with the acrid scent of the extinguished fire. Mark moved quickly to the mantel, his hand trembling as he grabbed the keys. "Let's go," he said, turning towards Cindy. A sound stopped them both in their tracks, a wet, dragging noise coming from the direction of the back door. Cindy's grip on the banister tightened, her knuckles white. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He raised the poker, his eyes locked on the dark hallway. The sound grew louder, closer, the unmistakable scrape of something heavy pulling itself across the floor. "Run," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. Cindy hesitated for only a heartbeat before darting toward the door. Mark followed, the sound of the dragging noise chasing them as they burst onto the porch and into the night. The truck's headlights pierced the darkness as Mark started the engine, the roar of it a lifeline in the oppressive silence. Cindy climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door just as something moved in the shadows at the edge of the yard. "Go," she screamed, her voice breaking. Mark didn't need to be told twice. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, the truck lurching forward as they sped down the dirt road. Cindy kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, her breath hitching as she caught a glimpse of the creature's massive silhouette emerging from the tree line. "It's following us," she said, her voice trembling. Mark gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "It can't keep up," he said, though his tone was far from certain. The road twisted and turned, the forest closing in on either side. Cindy's heart raced as she scanned the trees, half expecting the creature to burst from the shadows at any moment. But as the minutes stretched on, the oppressive weight of its presence began to lift. Finally, the cabin disappeared from view, swallowed by the darkness and distance. Cindy leaned back in her seat, her hands trembling as she wiped tears from her face. And then, just as the truck rounded the final bend in the road, it came. A low, guttural roar, distant but unmistakable. Cindy's eyes widened, her body going rigid as the sound echoed through the trees. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw clenched. Neither of them spoke, they only sound the hum of the engine as the truck carried them farther into the night. But the roar lingered in their minds, a chilling reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. The end. The hour grows late, dreamers, and the night calls you deeper into its embrace. Remember, the darkest dreams often linger, their whispers following you even as you wake. Sleep tight, but beware of what lies beyond the veil. Until next time.